Good morning to you all. This is, I hope that you can all see the screen. I cannot see it myself, but I trust we are live now online. Good morning to all of you in Europe and good afternoon to those joining from India or perhaps elsewhere. Thank you for being with us today to discuss the ongoing reorientation of the EU and EU member states in its relationship or their relationship with India. An increasingly important country and this year's host, of course, of the G20. And we'll be discussing opportunities for strengthened EU-India cooperation on strategic technologies. My name is Maaike Okano-Heijmans. I'm a senior researcher and head of the new Geopolitics of Tech and Digital program at the Clingendael Institute in The Hague, and I'll be your moderator today in this online debate. As most of you will know, we published recently a report entitled How Strategic Tech Cooperation Can Reinvigorate Relations Between the EU and India. And our report presents findings and policy recommendations from experts from the European Union and India on this given topic of strategic tech cooperation and opportunities for strengthened ties. This was co-edited by my colleague Vera Kranenburg and myself, and you will see Vera in a second at the Q&A session, which she will moderate. But first we'll have an opening panel discussion between three contributors in the report. I'll introduce them to you in a second. Opening remarks by our Dutch ambassador to Delhi, Marten van den Berg, and then some reflections also kindly given by Ms. Agnes Mulder of the Dutch Member of Parliament. So as a little bit of background to our report, let me share that we framed this debate against the setting of strategic autonomy, which is, of course, an objective of both India and the EU are striving after. And a key question, as a current scholar and former diplomat, Mohan Kumar once put it, we thought was an excellent way of framing the debate. And the key questions then are, can India help the EU to move closer to strategic autonomy through decreasing its dependence on China? Whereas on the other side, the key question for India is whether the EU and how the EU can help India to move towards strategic autonomy and economic resilience, specifically reducing its dependence on reliance on Russia. We have, of course, seen in the past few days interesting steps, the announcement of 3 working groups within the EU-India Trade and Technology Council that was announced last year as President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, visited Delhi. And 2 of those working groups are actually closely related to the topic of our report of strategic technologies. So I think it's really timely that we have brought together this group of scholars to discuss with you these important questions. And let me introduce them to you immediately. As I said, we're honored to have with us today, first of all, Mr. Marten van den Berg, Ambassador of the Netherlands to India. Then we have Yogesh Joshi. He's a research fellow at the Institute for Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. We have Pramit Chaudhuri, a distinguished fellow and head of strategic affairs at the Ananta Aspen Center. We have Stefania Benaglia, who co-authored with Rosanna Fani, I might add, a chapter. But Stefania will be presenting their views. She is the head of Global Connectivity Program at the Center of European Policy Studies in Brussels. And finally, to close us off, we have, as I said, Agnes Mulder, member of the Dutch Parliament, for the Christian Democratic Appeal. But before we turn to our panelists, let me give the floor, as I said, to Marten van den Berg, who has been ambassador of the Netherlands to India since 2018. So that's quite a few years. Marten, you have seen, of course, firsthand how the Netherlands and India's relations have evolved. And perhaps you could also reflect a little bit, not just on the Netherlands-India ties, but also EU-India ties. And of course, as a representative of the MFA, we're also perhaps for the information of our participants, curious to hear why you commissioned this topic, this report to Clingendael, because thanks to that, of course, we can have this timely discussion today. Marten, can I give you the floor?
Yeah, thank you so much, Maaike. And well, very happy about this report. Very happy about this, I think, very important and also very timely discussion. And that's, I think, we also have asked you to Clingendael institution to do some research on this, I think, very important topic. Maybe a few sentences about India, and then maybe a few sentences about this topic we are discussing today. Of course, saying a few sentences about India is almost impossible. We know the size and the numbers of India after 4.5 years. Sometimes they still amaze me, but at the same time is also, I think, why it's so important to have this discussion. Of course, India has many, many faces. It's a very diverse country. That's also something I very much like about India. But face of India is also about their innovation capacity, and also getting more and more relevant on innovative sectors, whether it's IT, AI, pharmaceuticals, space, satellites, so many issues where India is or becoming a giant, almost to say. It's of course a top 5 economy. They have growth figures of 7%. That's high given the global economic picture today. And because of the demographics, I expect they will continue to grow with higher growth numbers than anyone else, or at least than any other large country, and definitely will have higher growth figures than China. It's also a political superpower, almost a political superpower. It also presents itself as a very independent, short superpower, whether it's in the UN or the G20. And I think very relevant, and also I've seen this in the years I'm now here based in Delhi. The engagement India is looking engagement, strong engagement with the EU, with EU member states, with the United States, also parts in the Middle East, but especially EU and the United States. And of course, we share a concern about China, and China to India is maybe their biggest foreign concern. And at the same time, ultimately, India really faces huge challenges in security, but also in the impact of climate change, in water shortages. I mean, huge changes and huge impact. But I think the importance of India to the world, the importance of India to the EU and the Netherlands is really increasing. So I'm very happy that we do see, at least in the recent 5 years, a very strong and increasing connection between the EU and India, but also very much between the Netherlands and India. Why I'm so happy with the report? Because I think the report puts a discussion on India to a different level, a more strategic level. We know all the discussions about strategic autonomy, decoupling, make in India, make in the US, Europe, against the background of all the geoeconomic, geopolitics concerns of what's happening in the world. And I think that's exactly the background we need to have for a discussion between the EU and India, and also between the Netherlands and India. Again, as I said, it's a global economic and political power. But also, if you look to India, of course, there are a lot of differences between Europe and India, between the Netherlands and India. But if you look to fundamentals, there are also a lot of similarities. We are all looking for a rule-based global order. India is also, like us, basically, or working on a market oriented economy, a democracy. So a lot of fundamentals are like-minded. And then the question, can the relationship be helpful in strategic autonomy, or are we thinking about friendshoring or whatsoever? We all know that well, strategic autonomy is quite a challenge. Decoupling is quite a challenge. But I think the question is not so much about whether we can well, assist each other in these strategic autonomy discussions, relationship, but it's more the question of how can we do it, which is quite a challenge. But we see more and more institutions like the Technology Committee you mentioned, FTA agreement discussions we are having now between the EU and India, so many other connections taking place and improving, working on how we can do it. But I think definitely we should assist each other in working together in all those very, very geopolitical and geoeconomic discussions and questions we all face today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Martin. That was a very rich scene setting, both in terms of the geopolitical context, of course, and against which EU and India are trying to strengthen their ties, but also the relevance of cooperation for each other's, for both sides. So it's a domestic purposes. And then the question, of course, is not so much whether we can, we're helping each other on strategic autonomy, but the how question. That's I hope our panelists will bear in mind as they give their views. So let's turn to our panelists then. They all, as I said, contributed to our report, so you can read more in-depth more of their findings in this piece. We will give them roughly 5 minutes each to reflect on the key points presented in their paper, and then, of course, also on how exactly EU and India can enhance their cooperation and why this is really important. Because I think having a shared narrative for shared objectives is also important to clarify. And we're hoping that together that will make for a good diversity of views, and then, of course, valuable inputs for the Q&A that we will turn to next. And with that in mind, I would like to invite everybody to already put your questions in the chat, which is open, of course, to everybody in our Zoom session. Do feel free to just type your questions. As I said, my colleague Vera Mulder will be watching carefully, and she will pick, of course, the best questions for our debates after the input statements. So first, let's turn to Yogesh Joshi, who's, as I said, a research fellow with the National University of Singapore. He wrote a chapter entitled India and the EU, Opportunities to Deepen the Military Partnership. And it's interesting, of course, that the announcement of the TTC and the 3 working groups of the Trade and Technology Council, defense and military cooperation was not explicitly mentioned. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't see cooperation in this field, but at least not so much appetite to make that explicit, perhaps. So I'd be interested from Yogesh to hear his thoughts on this. But let's first kick us off with the question of how have India's defense partnerships with key countries evolved, and what's Europe's role in all this? Because we know that so far India's defense and military ties have been with other countries or a limited set of EU member states. Well, what's the picture that you foresee for the future? Yogesh, over to you.
Thanks, Maaike, for the invitation, not only for this webinar, but also for writing a chapter in the report. So thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. So let's just get to brass tacks in a sense. I think India's defense relationship, as one looks at historically, depended upon a number of factors. Historical relations with the Commonwealth and Western countries initially, kind of military challenges. But 2 most important factors, I think, which more or less defined India's defense relationships were economic efficiency of getting defense hardware, but also managing foreign policy, goals in a sense. And that drove India's, in my view, looking at historical evidence, India's defense relationships until recently. And there are 2 factors for it. One is that India is inherently a more secure country. We have never faced an existential crisis, as in Europe, or for that matter, in many Asian countries. And the second thing is that it was a resource, there was a resource crunch in a sense. So those 2 factors basically more or less defined India's defense relationship. So if you look until 1965, it is mostly Commonwealth countries. The US chips in a bit, France a bit as well. And after 1965, particularly after the 1965 India-Pakistan war, because of the sanctions, you shift to the Soviet Union, and that continues until late 1970s, when again there is an idea of diversification because of political changes within India, and you see the first of the submarine deals with Germany in HDW, the Jaguars being brought in. But the post-Cold War defense relationships were actually more or less defined by India's foreign policy goals of being accepted as a rising power. So the Indo-US defense relationship is actually much more a foreign policy, strategy to build India's relations with the US, and that paid fulsomely with the 2008 Indo-US nuclear deal, which basically brought India into the larger platform of rising powers, in a sense, accepting India's quest for being a major power. But most recently, I think there's a fundamental change. The fundamental change is that India has never faced a great power on its immediate borders, never in its history, for that matter. Even during the Cold War, the two great powers were distant. And Indian military never faced the US military, or for that matter, the Russian military. But this is the first time that in India's history that there is a great power which not only combines hostility, revisionism, but definitely a very high level of competition, which involves major issues, of concern for India. And that has changed India's approach, in some sense, to building its military relationships. It's much more, realistic. It's much more about operational and military capabilities, as prior to foreign policy issues. Now, there has been, an overdependence on Russia, and that is because of the historical reasons, as I underlined, particularly both in terms of foreign policy goals during the Cold War, as well as the economic efficiency of getting military stuff from Russia. But any overdependence is actually, in some sense, a vulnerability. We have seen that vis-a-vis trade with China. We are seeing that vis-a-vis, and Soviet Union as well as Russia has always, applied pressure on India. Even during the Cold War, for that matter, when India wanted to normalize relations with China in 1970s, Soviet Union actually used its military relationship to pressurize India not to do that. So in some sense, there is that vulnerability from overdependence, which Indians kind of understand, but because of the historical and legacy issues, can't really get out of it. But I also think that the Indian strategy is also to use that overdependence to negotiate with the West and the Europeans to kind of get better deals, right? So it's not just one factor going on in here. The second thing is that there's a growing realization of Russia's vulnerability as an autonomous great power. All things aside, in Eurasia, Russia as an autonomous great power provided India some kind of balancing vis-a-vis China. That is under serious question now. So in some sense, and lastly, that Russia is not India's biggest economic partner, right? So therefore, that relationship is highly truncated, and all that overdependence and loss of Russia's ability to kind of behave autonomously gives a lot of food for thought for India to kind of reduce its overdependence. I think there is therefore a very important opportunity for Europe and India to kind of collaborate. India's domestic manufacturing now, particularly the focus on domestic manufacturing, where FDI is allowed to 74% to 100%, kind of is an avenue where European firms can actually not only produce for India, but also for exports. And that is a strategy which Russia used initially, the French have used it, and as well as the Israelis have used it. So, in a sense that using India as a global manufacturing hub for defense manufacturing, in a sense, is an important part. The second part, I think, is for India-Europe Defense Cooperation, is that when you look at India's domestic manufacturing, it's much more self-sufficient in design and integration, but still a lot to do in subsystems, where the critical alloys, engines, sonars, radars, over-the-horizon missiles. And finally, India needs to diversify as well, get as much as technological inputs from every other place it can. So there's some big ticket items. There are a lot of small items, but there are a lot of big ticket items, particularly in the aircraft industry. And we saw that with the Airbus and Tata coming in together to produce tactical transport aircrafts. The French are heavily involved in the aircraft industry. So that would be one of the major, especially with the IAF's increasing demands of both logistical as well as fighter aircrafts. as well as helicopters, drones, fixed wing, as well as rotatory, aircrafts. That is one thing which I think is a big ticket item for Europe to look into. The second is India's underwater force, which is perennially in some sense deficient, right? And there has been a history of HDW and German firms, investing into that. India's first submarine building, systems basically came from HDW in Germany, and India is still looking for more partners to kind of develop that field. And lastly, about mountain warfare. At the end of the day, the India-China equation would be, I think, still very much into traditional modes of warfare fighting, particularly in the mountains. And therefore, there is a lot of talk about light tanks, anti-drone systems, and man-held portable anti-tank systems. And I think these are some of the very specific areas where India and Europe can actually collaborate. Just lastly, and finish in a minute, if you can allow me, I think there are a few things which India expects from the EU. And the first of that is to appreciate India's, security concerns. Much of European engagement with India has been around institutions for a very long period of time. Institutions, FTAs, and all of that. Human rights for that matter, and all those concerns which European Union as an institution has been able to apply in its own systems, but also expects from others. So I think there is a clear requirement for EU to kind of understand where India actually is in the larger security environment of the Indo-Pacific. The second thing is that the Indian defense relationships have always been bilateral, right? So it's very difficult for India to kind of deal with a conglomerate of states, where you have these dual regime systems, where not only you have EU regulations, but you also have individual states regulations, but also that many of the systems being produced are cooperation between a number of European countries for that matter. So that's a difficult situation. And as you rightly said, there should be a group within the Trade and Technology Initiative to just focus on how India and EU can actually focus much more on defense and military technologies and kind of streamline many of these regulatory issues. So therefore, there's definitely a need to form an EU-India defense group to sort out, to provide a roadmap for defense collaboration. And lastly, I think the free trade agreement, which is still pending, will help a lot. Just that it allows a lot more, kind of fulfills, one of the major steps which have not been still completed in India-EU relationship. I'll just stop there, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Yogesh. That's wonderful. You touched upon not just key findings of your report, but also some of the key questions we wanted to discuss of what are specific areas for collaboration. You mentioned in the military and defense tech specific areas, aircraft, underwater force. That's really important to know, of course, and it's good to know also what India expects. So understanding India's security concerns. Yes, this is what I've heard also from some other Asian countries, including, for example, Japan, where they have felt that the EU is not really engaged with their understanding of security challenges. So it's important you mention that. And let's hear later on whether this regulatory sort of streamlining of regulations can be also part indeed of the TTC. So thanks for that. We will now turn to Pramit Chaudhuri, as I said, with the Aspen Center, Ananta Aspen Center, I should say. He wrote a chapter in our report titled Delhi's New View of Europe. So something is changing, new view of Europe, opportunities for the tech partnership. So can you tell us a bit more, Pramit, about how Delhi's view is evolving in recent years, and does Delhi indeed recognize a role for Europe in its strategic autonomy, as has been suggested? Curious to hear your...
Yeah, great. So so India has traditionally treated its European policy as a bundle of bilateral relationships, of which Britain and to some degree France and obviously Germany. These were the three big European countries, and these are the big three European partners for India in most things. You had a number of countries, Netherlands in particular, who are large trading partners. But for the most part, and if you look at the record of Indian prime ministers, for example, even foreign ministers visiting European countries, I think, for example, when Prime Minister Modi visited Spain in his 4 or 5 years ago, it was the first time an Indian prime minister had visited Spain in almost 30 years. And a number of the Nordic countries, I believe there has never been an Indian prime minister until recently to have ever visited them, let alone the Central European states. So until recently, that was the basic treatment. The European Union as a whole was seen only as a trading bloc. It was not seen as a strategic partner, and in fact, not seen as a partner in almost anything. And as a consequence, the Indian ambassador to Brussels was always a trade negotiator. He was always a trade person, and not a diplomat concerned about strategic issues. A lot of that has begun to change. I think the core reasons were, one, Brexit. Britain was always, for historical and other reasons, the gateway for India to the rest of Europe, and it tended to see its Brussels relation. A lot of its European policy was done via London. Brexit obviously began to change that equation. Britain began to see that India began to see that it needed other partners in Europe to work with Brussels. So France, Germany, at one point I remember even Poland was interested in trying to work with India. And India began to start to spread that relationship. In addition, India's larger economic interests, as the economy grew, India became more interested in getting more foreign investment, more open to foreign investment. It began to look at other countries, in particular in the technology side, which is what I focused on. The Nordic countries, in particular, rose to a certain degree of prominence, and we saw the Nordic countries and India begin a series of Nordic summits, where 5 Nordic nations and India would meet collectively. India began also to consider, at one point, as planning a Visegrad summit as well, in which it would be a Visegrad plus the 4 Visegrad countries, plus I think Romania, and maybe it might have been Bulgaria, would hold a regular summit. That was interrupted by the COVID pandemic and now the Ukraine war, but that's still something on the cards as far as the Indian government is concerned. So otherwise, that relationship, so India is now beginning to see Europe in a lot more expansive manner than it did so before. Part of the reason is, I mentioned, the rise of its spreading economic interests. It's the decline of Britain, if you wish, as its primary European arbiter. Also, I should add, in terms of personalities, the present Indian foreign minister, who is he's a Czech and Russian-speaking Indian diplomat who has served in a number of European countries, but took a larger, broader view of Europe, I would argue, than many of our previous foreign ministers did. So all of that has come together to make India begin to look at Europe in a new fashion, and particularly the European Union. As I said, now India is beginning to be more holistic in its approach. The strategic element remains a big question. As the previous speaker mentioned, India continues to be very wary about buying weapon systems from Europe outside of France, where, of course, it has a long-standing defense relationship. It does not see its primary strategic sphere, obviously, is the Indo-Pacific area right now, in which the Quad and a number of bilateral and trilateral relationships built around the Quad dominate its foreign policy. It has Indo-Pacific agreements or understandings, notably only again it sees France as the only real European power in this sphere, but does not see the larger EU as a concern or as a partner yet in the Indo-Pacific. And I think on the technology side, what we're seeing India is working on a number of issues. One, it recognizes that India has struggled to develop a genuine innovation cycle, and particularly between the laboratory and the factory. It's really never been able to bridge that. Its businesses, it's called private companies, obviously deal a lot with the Western. It's largely almost completely a Western-oriented business society with a little bit of Japan and Southeast Asia and the Gulf involved. But for the technology side, it's largely the West. But for the government and the G2G side of it, India now sees an opportunity. The China Plus strategies of a lot of Western companies as they try to diversify away from China gives India an opportunity. And we're starting to see, in particular in the electronics field, and I cite the example of Apple, in a rather remarkable expansion of its assembly lines in India, as a prime example. But what we're really seeing again, the focus is the Indo-Pacific. So India's Japan, Taiwan, the United States, obviously, are the key companies and countries that India is working with. Now, it has worked out a number of bilateral agreements with some European countries, particularly with Britain in the pharmaceutical industry, pharmaceutical agreement that was made between them. It's done similar things, obviously, with Germany and a few others, but it has yet to develop a sense or understanding. There's a bit of it in the corporate world, but definitely not at the government level, I would argue, a real sense of what Europe as a whole brings to the table for India technologically. Individual companies have a different sense of that. And part of that is cultural. If you look at India's real success has been in the digital sphere, and it's been the United States, partly because of the very successful Indian-American community in California and elsewhere. That has been a major bridge between these two, and that's now built a very strong relationship. That's partly true in pharmaceuticals, where northern New Jersey is the pharma hub of the United States. If you go there again, it's like a little India because of the sheer number of Indian scientists who have settled there. So this tends to bias India in favor of, always been a bias of English towards English-speaking nations, but especially to the United States and to some degree Britain. The trade and technology, the TTC agreement is particularly important because it provides for the first time a genuine institutionalization of an India-EU technology. If you look at the past, India and the European Union sign endless technology agreements, all of which disappear about 1 year later because nobody pays any attention to them. The TTC will be the first attempt, and when I've talked to EU diplomats, they said it's the purpose of the TTC, is to try and create an institutionalized basis for India and the European Union to work together at a G2G basis. And hopefully this then begins to expand into something larger at the business level. A key weakness, I think, continues to be, and it's been one of the core strengths of, I think, of the English-speaking world, is the lack of Indian students in continental Europe. Other than, in fact, the Netherlands and increasingly Germany, there are virtually no Indian students of science students in Europe, at least compared to America, Britain, now Australia and Canada. Canada in particular has risen dramatically past few years. And that human bridge is extraordinarily important in just making decisions as to where exactly India should look for technology, because there's simply lack of knowledge about what other countries bring to the table. It's a problem that even exists, for example, with Japan as well, despite a very close government-to-government relationship. But it's one of the key elements that's missing there. The TTC hopefully will bring an institutional element now to that technology understanding, but the awareness part, I think, remains core, and the strategic part still got a long way to go.
Thanks for that, Pramit. So let's see if the TTC indeed can bring in that strategic element or understanding of the strategic importance of working with the EU as a whole, and also on the Indian side. And I guess, yeah, I would love to hear perhaps later in the conversation what exactly you or other participants feel that the EU and the member states should do in order to achieve that, because there must be thoughts on this as well. But before getting there, let's get a European view on board. Turn to Stefania Benaglia. As I said, she's with the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and co-authored a chapter with Rosanna Fanny, who's, as I understood just this morning, is a key player in making the TTC happen, at least on the European side, facilitating for the EU, European Commission, also this TTC. So perhaps we can bring in Rosanna later. But together they titled this chapter, they authored this chapter titled A View from Europe on the Role of Technology in the EU-India Relations, focusing on the Trade and Technology Council. So let's hear from Stefania first, where she sees the main opportunities and challenges for strengthened cooperation on strategic technologies, and what is needed really to make the most, to deliver on the potential that we've heard several speakers now say exists for enhanced tech cooperation between the EU and India. Stefania, please.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. Indeed, as you say, I mean, we're confronted today with an India that will soon become the most populated country in the world. Its growing influence as a global power is also behaving as a global actor in a way as a balancing actor and with a balancing act. So as you said, the question is not if we should cooperate with India, but how we should cooperate with India. Now, I front load my main point right now. I first start seeing a risk actually with connectivity. What I mean here is that we are witnessing a mushrooming of connectivity models. We have, of course, the Chinese one, we have the European with Global Gateway, we have other models which are coming up. We have the Japanese model, which is there since a long time, the ASEAN, the G7, the US, and I'm pretty sure that tomorrow we will see more of them. Now, of course, the key question here to meet global goals, the SDGs, but also the Paris Agreement, is to ensure that there is interoperability and complementarity between those connectivity models. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve these global goals. So here we have the risk. Now, digital connectivity in this context really is a solution to this, because if we ensure complementarity and interoperability within the digital domain, we really are in a better position. And with this, in this context, the Trade and Technology Council can be the tool to make sure that we ensure this complementarity and this interoperability. So I really see a key importance in the Trade and Technology Council because of this context. And can now even more of this if we ensure a degree of complementarity with the US Trade and Technology Council. We have an even bigger, we have the possibility of achieving even greater goals. Because of course, if we start bringing coherency in and working in synchron how we understand the use of especially future technologies, because future technologies are the use of them and the democratic component of those, the question is very much up in the air still, because we haven't developed them yet. And even current use of technology, how we integrate the democratic values with them, it's very much up for discussion still. So if we actually manage to achieve a coherent understanding between the EU, the US, and India, well, then we start forming a majority, and then we really can have an impact. So that's why I think that the Trade and Technology Council is really a key tool, and why bringing a degree of complementarity and working in synchro with the Trade and Technology Council with the US is really important in this context. Now, zooming in a little bit more in how this TTC can actually play this role. We've seen, and you mentioned before that they have just announced, they waited for our discussion to announce the composition of the workshop and the TOR of this Trade and Technology Council. We have been waiting for almost a year for this TOR. So we finally can see what it will focus on and what it will not focus on. The first is indeed developing strategic technologies and digital governance and digital connectivity. So exactly, looking a little bit more at the future front. Now, this is really crucial when it comes to implementing these shared democratic principles that are at the core of the strategic partnership between the EU and India. And this is also I think, a very good tool that can be useful for reshifting the focus of, I mean, the UN is no secret that the UN and India have had difficulties on having human rights discussions because, you know, that here we enter a much bigger discussion, but this is an observation. Now, refocusing this kind of discussion in this context, more neutral context, where everybody actually is confronted with a current use and even more a future of use of tomorrow's technology. Here we have a much more, we frame the discussion in different terms where we don't have expectations and played roles from the past. So this can really be crucial for also having a more constructive discussion with India on this front of human rights. And this, of course, is crucial for what I said before, you know, forming the majority for tomorrow on how technology is intended and utilized globally. Now, the second workshop is on green and clean energy technology. And for me, this is simply a formalization of a realization that we cannot have a green transition without a digital component. So this workshop simply formally brings these two trends together. These two trends have been, you know, working in synchro for a while, but we were missing until now an institutionalized forum, which is what will be provided here. And then the third one, the trade and investment and resilient value chains. This is a little more going towards what I was saying before, ensuring that we have a healthy competition between connectivity models, because of course, when I mean this, priorities will remain there, and that's okay. But if we want to meet Paris Agreement, SDGs, we have to work together, all of us. So this third workshop is for me the opportunity to translate this principle from theoretical into action. And how are we making sure? Because of course, EU and India have the connectivity partnership, which is one of the pillars of the strategic partnership. So this third is really how do we translate this principle in concrete terms? Of course, there is much more to share, but I want to stop here and just conclude because everything else can be discussed during the Q&A. But as conclusion, simply to leave you with the understanding that for me, institutionally, the strategic partnership reached maturity. Now we have our pillars that have been addressed. We have the trade with the FTA, which will hopefully be signed soon. We have the Trade and Technology Council, which will address the whole technological component that we've been saying is really crucial. We have the connectivity partnership that takes care of and many other issues. We have a growing defense cooperation. We haven't mentioned, but of course we have the maritime security, which is growing. We have discussion on participating in PESCO projects. I mean, that is maybe has not been formalized in the Trade and Technology Council, which was one of the expectations amongst others, but still perhaps is because it is developing in its own terms. So it doesn't need this extra layer, perhaps. So we have this institutional framework, which is sufficient right now. What we need to do is really now start to implement through these tools, to implement it in a coherent way with the values that we claim to share. Because again, we have this, sharing democratic values is the core of our strategic partnership. We have now the tools, and now we need to simply see how this will be implemented. Now, bringing in as a final comment, if you do have more specific questions on how to bridge between the US and the India Trade and Technology Council, as Maaike flagged, there is Rosanna, which I understand is in the audience. She is leading the CEP's participation, and CEP's implements actually the Trade and Technology Council dialogue. So she really is the best person to address all the questions related to the Trade and Technology Council's plural. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stefania. That's very important to know, of course, your important role in this TTC and the opportunity to discuss then also with you and Rosanna on this. But thank you also for bringing in democratic principles and the TTC as a tool, basically, for the EU and India to discuss also how democratic principles can be woven into the strategic tech cooperation. I think that's a really important part. Also to be discussed. So before we turn to Q&A, I would like to invite now Ms. Agnes Mulder, who will add a Dutch perspective to our debate. Agnes has for more than 10 years been a member of the Dutch Parliament, as I said, for the Christian Democratic Appeal, and has taken a broad interest in issues of foreign affairs, economic affairs, and European affairs. So I think this all comes together really nicely. I thought it was also wonderful, Agnes, if I may mention this, your active participation in the recent debate that we had in Parliament on India. I think it's important for everybody to know that the Dutch Parliament is investing in more knowledge and debate on India, trying to higher their level of understanding and perhaps hopefully also of the security concerns of India, as was flagged earlier. So I was wondering, could you please reflect on why this is the case, and also whether we should take this as a sign of willingness of the Dutch Parliament, and then as an extension of that, perhaps the Dutch government, which you have some influence over steering, of course, to reconsider long-standing policies with regard to India, as we have seen also there's some requests in that regard. So Agnes, please share with us your views. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you, other panelists, for your interesting remarks this morning. I was writing lots of things down, of course, to implement them maybe later in a visit to India. We're trying to visit it as Parliament India this year. We are not quite sure whether this will happen or not. It's always difficult to arrange these things, but we really want to speak to our colleagues and NGOs and people from government positions to see whether we can enhance our cooperation. As a member of Parliament, the last 10 years I've been a spokesperson for climate and energy related issues. And I've spoken to many colleagues abroad, also within the IPU, the Interparliamentarian Union. This is like the UN is for governments. Is this a forum for democratic parliaments and more autocratic parliaments, but who do consider themselves as a democracy, to speak to one another. And I'm the chair of one of the standing committees on sustainability. And there I meet regularly with my colleagues from India as well. And they are really very interested in how we can cooperate. We have a lot of knowledge, of course, in the Netherlands on circular economy and also on climate-related issues, climate adaptation especially. And when you look at the concerns by my colleagues in their provinces, they have lots more devastating rainy seasons, like we see also, of course, in the Netherlands, in Limburg. We had so many people that were encountered with too much water, and they still suffer the consequences. And of course, this is what their constituents also have in India. So we need to see beyond the governments and the representatives and look at the people who are finally the ones that we are doing all the work for. So that's why I was particularly interested in what our panelists from SEPS told about the democratic values, and how can we really connect to one another on the level of the people, because this is where it should start, I think. And we can do a lot of things together on the climate related issues. It's really a path forward in these very difficult circumstances that we're in now. I just returned from Ukraine, and it's so saddening what happens there. And it totally, of course, rearranges the entire geopolitical situation. But how can we prevent becoming a member of one of the two camps? And we know for sure that India doesn't want to be in one of the camps. So how can we look at each other and find the path that we can walk together? And I think the technology and trade is of course one of the most important ones, especially if you look at the knowledge we can share on the circular economy. the colleagues from India I spoke to, they really want to address this issue with us as well. But also our knowledge from Wageningen, of course. Food security is really important. So there are lots of things that we can do together, and hopefully from our parliament on, we can we can stimulate this. And that's why I was one of the members who took the initiative for the roundtable meeting, as you already said, Maaike, before, because I think it's really important to know more about each other's situations. And in this regard, it's also very important for us to know how India, of course, views the EU and the bilateral relationships. So we need to invest heavily in the bilateral relationship, but also on the European level. And this, of course, it's important for our companies. Years ago, I visited Thales. It's one of the innovative companies in the east of the Netherlands, and they encountered certain measures from dual use. And we are more strict on this issue in the Netherlands than maybe other European countries. And that is why we said we want to have this European framework to have a more equal level playing field for all of the companies. And this is something that we should take care of within the European Union. And I think our government made a good Indo-Pacific statement, which is used also in the European context. And we've had other countries commenting on this as well, that they really said it's a good thing to maybe implement this. And I think within foreign affairs, they're already working with this, of course, but it's never been discussed in our parliament. And so I think the next step should be that we're going to seriously discuss how we view the things from our parliament on, and then strengthening, hopefully, the ties this year with our members of parliament in India. That would be great. And I think we need to strengthen the ties also on the defense sector, because we need to be frank with one another. Maybe it's also the other way around in India, that they provide the Russians with arms as well. We do not want to encounter these arms in Ukraine, of course. We're sending our arms to Ukraine. So I think we should have frank, open discussions with one another, and help one another on a path forward, and maybe be an alternative to India for Russia. But of course, we all know that India knows very much how they want to act, and maybe we can convince them to do more with us, and that it's good for them and it's also good for us.
Thanks, Agnes. Yes, wonderful. That's a clear willingness indeed to reconsider some old policies, long existing policies, but also with a very realistic mindset of what we want, of course, of our role in the world, and ideally cooperating with India on that. You mentioned implicitly, of course, export controls, and indeed the differences between EU member states in implementing those. And the Netherlands being more strict than others, also because of a role of parliament. Of course, our export controls and decisions, they go public through parliament. So you have a role here, I think, also, if that is going to be altered. So perhaps something else for that we could discuss more in depth later on. But let me first turn to Vera, my colleague Vera Kranenburg, who's been watching carefully Q&A. I saw many questions already in the chat. So Vera, could you perhaps raise to specific panelists, or perhaps to anyone in particular, the most important the questions, perhaps bundling a few?
Yes. We've received a couple of questions, and one of the first ones is addressed to Pramit and Stefania, which is specifically about the TTC process parallel to the FTA agreement negotiations with India, and whether you see the TTC helping to get these trade negotiations finalized given the challenges that they face. And Maaike, did you say you want to bundle? So I can add maybe a second one that was also addressed to Pramit and Stefania, which was on the Make in India policies. The question states that the EU is concerned about Make in India policies because they are seen to discriminate against EU businesses and violate WTO rules. Can you see the TTC help to overcome these type of concerns? And if so, how would that go? So those are the first two questions that we can address.
Excellent. So Pramit, maybe you want to go first, and then next we go to Stefania and or Rosanna, if you can add something.
Sure. I think Stefania probably know more about the TTC and the FTA than I would. But my understanding is that the TTC should actually, if anything, supplement the FTA understanding, because a large portion of the FTAs that India is signing nowadays bilaterally, it's done with Australia. It should conclude one with Britain next month. It's signed with the United Arab Emirates. We'll be signing with the Gulf Cooperation Council, with Israel, and a few other countries. All of them have the core of them, digital policies, data, cross-border data flow policies, and so on, are really much more important than they ever were before. And things like the TTC should help align India with the European Union on those issues, as I said, very important elements of the FTA. When it comes to Make in India, so what basically I think, if you were to say what is the trade policy of India today, it is to deny China access to the Indian market. And if that requires India to violate or break the letter, if nothing, the spirit of the WTO, India will do so. Partly because other countries are doing the same thing. In fact, the country that we are most closely aligned with this, I know in private discussion, is the United States, where America is no longer prepared to abide by a lot of its own FTA agreements if that gives China greater access to the US market. In India, the game is on two fronts when it comes to China, and this is basically now distorting its trade policy or changing its trade policy. One is that low-end manufactured goods, in which it believes that Chinese goods are eradicating jobs in India, will simply not be allowed. That was the reason why India walked out of the RCEP, though having been a member of its original negotiation. And it will not sign any FTA that is now explicit within the government that gives China access to the Indian market, and is even trying to renegotiate some of its existing FTAs that give China indirect access. And the Make in India, much of the Make in India program is largely built around that. Now, what's happening, unfortunately, of course, is that once you allow protectionism in through the door, immediately lobby groups start to push the same policy that was originally aimed at stopping Chinese goods into stopping other goods. And that's been one of the battles within the Indian system of trying to ensure that that does not happen. And one of the reasons for the new round of bilateral FTAs India is doing is to try to rebuild or ensure that that doesn't happen, but in either a plurilateral, but largely in a bilateral framework, because it will not and does not want to have anything to do with China. The second element of its China policy is to ensure, or try to ensure over time, that data in India, any data flow, any data storage will not be done with a Chinese product. So India just recently rolled out its new 5G policy. ZTE, Huawei were completely banned. And in fact, any Chinese company was banned from being part of that 5G. Yesterday, if I'm correct, they banned 249 Chinese apps. That's on top of almost 100 other Chinese apps, starting with TikTok from previous 2 years. And it comes down to the simple issue of trying to ensure that as little Indian data as possible goes through any Chinese product or any Chinese gear or any Chinese software. So that is now the other element of a lot of what India is doing. There's another element of Make in India, which I can talk about later, which is on the defense side, but that goes into something larger about Russia and the relationship that India is trying to build on its defense side, and we can go into that later.
Thanks. So Stefania, then to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I kind of maybe merge both questions because they're indeed much relevant to one another. The way I would read it is that especially the third workshop of the Trade and Technology Council, the one that addresses the resilient value chain, is indeed going to be kind of like the forum where they can discuss in practical terms the things that are not solved in the FTA. So that's how I see actually the two being propedeutic to one another in this sense. So one is actually not the operational, but is the forum where you can actually untangle all the issues and finding a solution. Now, the FTA itself, of course, as most FTAs, this makes no exception, is a lengthy process. It started off with political announcement of brevity, which of course was not backed up by actions because FTAs are extremely technical, extremely complicated. And if you actually, this is in general terms, and the EU and India, which potentially, I mean, I would claim that today is one of top three most important and influential FTAs globally that will ever be signed. So of course there is ultra political attention to this FTA. So I do not expect this exercise to be taken lightly by any part, which is de facto not what is the situation right now. So I do see the two working one together with the other, using the TTC to help progress with the FTA. But I do also see the importance given to, signing an FTA that will address all issues that will, that will really be setting for the future trend. So it's really an important one. That's why it is, it's as I also share, when they entered, there were two approaches. One was entering and delivering on the immediate deliverables and then tackling the most complicated issues later on. That was not the preferred option for the EU because there was a risk of never going to tackle the most difficult issues. So they ended up tackling the whole FTA at overall, and that of course will take some time. But we're all in positive, an optimistic approach there. And if, I don't know if there's the opportunity for Rosanna to enter in the discussion and say something if she wants.
Let's see about that later then, Stefania, if she's in the Zoom session. For now, Vera, what other questions? I see a few things about military and defense tech and export controls, I believe, right?
Yes, we also received two questions, I think mostly addressed to Yogesh, but maybe Pramit also wants to chip in.
Agnes or Marten?
Of course. Which is on, if India wants to reduce its armed dependency on Russia, how long would it realistically take? And are there good opportunities for India to buy European if they are planning to do so? And the second question is on how to overcome the doubts on what the EU can bring to the table in terms of defense cooperation and technology. For example, on some European companies' question on the investment climate or governments hesitant about dual-use export. Where can we start and what is the most promising?
Should I? Okay.
Please.
So there's no definitive answer to, in a sense, at some point in time, there are many studies which kind of put India's dependency and particularly, the legacy dependencies in some sense between 60 to 80%, because of much of the inventory, still particularly in the Indian army, comes from, from Russia, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. So there is definitely an issue of how to reduce this dependence. And I think Make in India particularly does that, right? The more you make in India, the more it reduces India's dependence on Russia. But I think still, one needs to kind of understand that, look, there are certain technologies which no one else would provide India, even with the kind of progress we have seen in India-US relationship, which the Russians have actually done. And the prime example of that is India's SSBN program, right? the kind of assistance which the Russians have provided in India's SSBN program is phenomenal in some sense, even against all the non-proliferation rules and regulations for that matter, all those concerns. So I think there is that big ticket technology items which only Russia has been forthcoming to kind of provide. But it's not that, that Indians are not looking to diversify. So again, giving the SSPN program, India has an active SSN program, or at least the Indian Navy wants attack nuclear submarines. And they do understand that there are technology deficiencies on the Russian side, right? And therefore, one of the most, the Indians are interested in the French Barracudas. So it is also depends upon how much, how forthcoming are some of these other countries, particularly in Europe. And again, as the previous speakers basically mentioned, we are talking about few within Europe, and particularly France, so to say, and in some sense, look, France is not, there was an Indian ambassador who basically told me that France is the new Russia for India, right? Not only in terms of defense, kind of defense deals, which India's high profile defense deals, which India is doing, but France has also overtaken Russia in terms of as India's chief proponent in the UN Security Council, right? So the job which Russia was doing in the UN Security Council, more and more of that is done by France. So I think there is a genuine effort to reduce dependence, and it's reduced dependence from everyone in some sense or the other. But one has to look into the peculiarity of the moment of India's defense manufacturing. We're basically trying to combine the third industrial revolution with the fourth industrial revolution, right? You're doing basic manufacturing, but you also want to kind of inculcate those technologies which are in the fourth industrial revolution. So you need as much as you can from all kind of different partners. And it is for Indian foreign policy to leverage these moments in international politics, but also India's economic prowess to kind of do leverage as much as they can from different partners and reduce to a certain extent over dependence on one particular actor. I would stop there.
Thanks a lot, Yogesh. Perhaps Agnes, would you like to also contribute here?
Well, thank you. And I think it's very important for us to look into the possibilities that we have in Europe to play this role for India without losing our own values. And we should really look into where the values meet and where it can reduce dependency we both do not want to have.
Thanks. Marten, anything from your side? Yes, I see two fingers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There are just a few observations from my side. What can Europe bring to the table? I think Europe can bring a lot to the table also in the defense area, whether it's on AI, on material technologies, on semicon, maritime, aerospace. And there is quite some discussions and dialogues, and also strategic collaboration is taking place. Very much agree that India is very much looking for other strategic partners in the area of defense, and the European countries, also the Netherlands in a way, are seen as a partner also on the strategic level. I'm a little bit more positive one of the former speakers that on the EU side as well, on the bilateral with the member states side, there is more strategic collaboration going on already, also G2G. Also the Netherlands has partly G2G strategic technology program for quite some years, which is on water, on health, on climate. So there are a lot of issues where we see from a European perspective also a more strategic approach from India to the EU as a whole, but definitely also as to member states. And indeed, Make in India also plays a certain role. There are concerns on the European side. At the same time, European and also Dutch companies are benefiting from these policies. But also from the Indian side, for example, there is concern about the cross-border adjustment policies from the European side. So of course, there are always concerns to both sides if you talk about trade and investment relations or technology relations. And that's exactly why we have the process of the TTC and the FTA in place to see how we can address these concerns from both sides. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. That's important points to add, and thanks for being specific here. Also, that's important. I'm looking at the time and aware that well, we're going to have to close up soon. So I was wondering, you know, closing is difficult, but it's always fun, I think, and useful to have a sort of a last round where we give all speakers a final say. And I would like to invite then all of you to reflect, perhaps give your one wish for the EU-India Trade and Technology Council. So in other words, what in your view is missing today and what should we have in, say, 6 months, thanks to the Trade and Technology Council? If you can share with us that, I think we'll have a powerful closing of this very inspiring debate. And perhaps we can go in a reverse order. So Agnes, if you have any thoughts on this, I know you're not closely related, of course, to the Trade and Technology Council, but surely you will have some thoughts on this.
Well, when I was in Egypt with the Committee of Economic Affairs for the climate-related issues, the loss and damage was on the agenda for the first time, and that was because of Europe. And we changed our position over there. And this could be, this could stimulate relationships, I think, because a lot of countries, also in the surroundings of India, are dependent on loss and damage and adaptation measures. And if we could put that into practice for the next climate meeting, this would be great.
Thank you very much. So that's especially for working group 2, I suppose, then on green technologies. Then let's turn to Stefania. Your one wish for the Trade and Technology Council in 6 months.
Thanks. Yes. First, I would like to say that it's difficult for me to refrain not to continue the discussion of before, but thank you for giving us a very stimulating discussion. That's all I wanted to say. My one wish in 6 months' time is to move forward with the most immediate one, which is the third one on connectivity. We have the connectivity partnership, which is also ongoing since a year. We are ready to move some concrete progress, and the third workshop is the one ideal for this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Then Pramit, over to you.
So I think a couple of dilemmas India is facing right now. One is that the experience of high fuel prices over the past 1 year, partly because of Ukraine, but also because of underinvestment in fossil fuels generally globally, has meant that India faces an issue of how does it handle baseload power. Its baseload power is fundamentally coal-driven. Its original plan was to switch to LNG as a transition fuel and develop solar plus storage. The storage is not happening because critical minerals are simply too expensive. If you look at it, India has 61,000 megawatts of solar installed capacity, only 500 megawatts of storage, and that's not going to increase very much. It's too expensive. But the LNG story is also a disaster because the price is simply now too high. Green hydrogen can only take away a little bit of this issue. It can help, but it's an extraordinarily expensive. India is now re-looking at what do they do about baseload. India's had to massively increase coal consumption over the past 1 year because of these issues. It wants to stop this. The BJP, the ruling party, is the party of climate in India. The right wing is the climate party, climate group in the country. And Prime Minister Modi in particular is very committed on this front, but they don't know what to do about it. They're looking at nuclear in particular now. It's coming back into the Indian debate in a way but they need a solution on that front. I think that's one very crucial element. Second, India is in the process of rebuilding or setting out its policies on digital issues, everything from artificial intelligence to e-commerce. It does not see the European Union as a perfect model, which it believes has destroyed the commercial development of digital economy, but it doesn't particularly like the monopoly-driven structure that the United States has. So it's negotiating something in between. And that is a process that is also continuing to take place, and it has for a time been looking overseas for models, but it still needs to work those out. Finally, on defense, what others have mentioned, and I think I'll reiterate, India would prefer to make the weapons itself. And that right now, the country that is the strongest supporter of that initiative has actually been the United States increasingly, especially in the area of jet engines and fighter technology. But to some degree, some European countries, France is there as well. But ultimately, what you really want to do to break India's dependence on Russia is to help India make its own weapons.
Thanks, Pramit. That's 3 clear wishes. And hopefully deliverables then. Not sure if that can be in 6 months, but on the agenda. Yogesh, over to you.
I think there's fundamentally EU and India, and this goes both ways, have to start taking each other as serious military actors, right? That is fundamental in some sense, and therefore, not having a defense and military group within the TTC, which is not, an innocuous omission in a sense, also underlines that in some sense, India thinks that EU is basically, still bandwagoning on the American military, right? It's not a strategic military actor. And EU's focus on India again is not as a serious military actor in the Indo-Pacific, except France for that matter. I think there is fundamentally, there needs to be a fundamental realization that these are serious military actors in their own rights, right? And we have seen that in Ukraine war, but also if you look at India, if one looks at the balance of power, there is only one nuclear power in the whole of Asia which actually stands up to China, right? You can talk about Japan, you can talk about Australia, you can talk about alliances for that matter. India's strategic autonomy also comes from the very fact that it's actually a very strong military power. So I think there is that need to accept each other as serious military actors. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Yes. Whether perhaps the EU has a mandate to talk, on behalf of EU member states, also with third partners on this, could be the real issue why it's not on the agenda. But perhaps that's something that should be overcome then, rather than shoved aside. Martin, I'll turn to you again for our last, perhaps one wish for the TTC.
I think it's very important to map in a way what we consider strategic supply chains, then map how these supply chains are structured globally, and see how we can make them more resilient or how we can decouple, because we have lots of abstract discussions on strategic autonomy, but that's very difficult to bring that into practice, what it exactly means. So I think you should go back to the supply chain level and see what kind of policies, whether it's regulatory policies or research policies, are needed to make them indeed more resilient and maybe even decoupling them from certain players. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. Great suggestion. Make it specific and build up, knowledge on what is actually happening on the ground. Wonderful debates. As always, time is too short, but I trust this is the beginning of something bigger. We hope to continue this type of conversation in the future with all of you. But I have to, of course, say time is up for today. So let me thank again all our speakers, Marten van den Berg, Yogesh Joshi, Pramit Chaudhuri, Stefania, Benaglia, and of course, Agnes Mulder. Thank you so much for sparing time to be with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.